My son said, "You're not family anymore." I smiled. Because the house was still in my name, the last thing I ever expected to hear from my own son was, "You're not family anymore." Those 6 words hit harder than any doctor's diagnosis I'd ever received, harder than losing my wife 12 years earlier, harder than the countless sleepless nights I spent working overtime to give him the life I never had. But I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg him to take those words back. I simply smiled. Because there was one thing neither my son nor his wife had ever bothered to verify. The house they were so eager to throw me out of was still legally mine. Listen, my name is Richard Lawson. I'm 68 years old, and I've lived in the same quiet neighborhood in Bellevue, Washington, for over 35 years. If you drove past my 2-story brick house on Northeast 24th Street, you'd probably think it belonged to a happy family. The lawn was always trimmed. The porch lights came on every evening at sunset. Every Christmas, the roof sparkled with lights my late wife, Margaret, insisted on putting up long before Thanksgiving. From the outside, we looked like the American dream. Inside, it was falling apart one quiet disappointment at a time. Margaret and I were married for 41 years before cancer took her. She wasn't just my wife. She was my best friend, my business partner, and the only person who truly understood why I worked so hard. We started with almost nothing. No wealthy parents. No inheritance. No lucky break. I spent 38 years as a commercial electrician, taking every overtime shift I could find across King County. Margaret worked as an elementary school librarian. Every paycheck had a purpose. Every dollar had a destination. Vacations were rare. Luxury cars never interested us. Designer clothes weren't part of our lives. Instead, we paid extra toward the mortgage every single month. When friends upgraded to bigger homes, we stayed exactly where we were, quietly building equity while everyone else built debt. By the time I retired, that house wasn't just paid off. It represented 4 decades of sacrifice. Every scratch on the hardwood floors reminded me of my son Ethan learning to ride his little plastic bike inside during rainy Washington winters. Every wall carried memories Margaret and I had built together. To me, it wasn't real estate. It was our life's work. After Margaret passed away, the silence inside the house became unbearable. Ethan started visiting more often. At first, I thought it was because he missed his mother. Maybe he was worried about me living alone. Maybe he genuinely wanted to spend time together. I wanted to believe that. A father wants to believe the best about his child. Ethan was 42 by then, married to a woman named Jessica. They had 2 young children and lived in a small townhouse about 20 minutes away in Redmond. Every visit followed the same pattern. Jessica would compliment the house. She'd mention how spacious it felt, how perfect the backyard would be for the kids, how expensive housing had become around Seattle. At first, those comments seemed harmless, normal conversation. Then they became more frequent, almost rehearsed. One Sunday afternoon, while we were drinking coffee in my kitchen, Jessica ran her fingers across the granite countertop before casually saying, "You know, Richard, this place is way too big for one person." Ethan nodded immediately. "She's right, Dad." I laughed. I've been hearing that for years. But neither of them laughed back. That should have been my first warning. Over the following months, their suggestions became recommendations. Recommendations became pressure. Pressure slowly became an expectation. They insisted I be happier in a retirement community. They showed me glossy brochures for senior living neighborhoods outside Tacoma. They emailed me listings for small condominiums. Jessica even offered to help me downsize. She made it sound thoughtful, helpful, loving. But something about her smile never reached her eyes. I politely declined every single time. This house wasn't just where I lived. It was where Margaret still existed in every photograph, every flower bed she planted, every recipe card tucked inside the kitchen drawer. Leaving felt like abandoning her all over again. Still, Ethan didn't stop. One evening, after family dinner, he stayed behind while Jessica loaded the kids into their SUV. He leaned against the kitchen counter and sighed. "You've got to think about the future, Dad." "I do." "No, I mean our future." Those 3 words stayed with me long after he drove away. Our future. Not mine. Not ours as father and son. His. For the first time in my life, I wondered whether my son was looking at me or simply waiting for what he believed would eventually become his. I wish I had listened to that instinct, because I had no idea the worst betrayal of my entire life was already quietly taking shape inside the very home I had spent 40 years protecting. If you've lived long enough, you learn that betrayal rarely arrives with shouting. It comes disguised as concern. Looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact moment my son stopped treating me like his father and started treating me like an obstacle. It happened about 8 months after Margaret passed away. At first, Ethan and Jessica began dropping by almost every weekend. They brought groceries I hadn't asked for, insisted on mowing my lawn, and even started organizing cabinets that didn't need organizing. Any outsider would have called them devoted. I wanted to believe they were. Truthfully, after losing my wife, their company helped fill the silence that echoed through every room of the house. My grandchildren, Noah and Lily, brought laughter back into a home that had forgotten what joy sounded like. We'd bake cookies together, watch baseball games in the living room, and I'd tell them stories about their grandmother planting roses in the backyard. Those moments were real. That's what made everything that followed hurt even more. Little by little, Ethan began inserting himself into decisions that had never belonged to him. He offered to help with my finances. Then he suggested I add his name to my checking account just in case of emergencies. A few weeks later, Jessica recommended that I let Ethan handle my utility bills because technology can be confusing. I smiled politely. I'm old, I said. I'm not helpless. For a brief second, I caught disappointment flashing across Jessica's face before she forced another smile. It wasn't a concern she was hiding. It was frustration. That was when I quietly decided something. I wouldn't confront them. I'd observe them. For 38 years as an electrician, I'd learned one simple rule. Before you fix a problem, you identify where the current is really coming from. People aren't much different. One rainy Tuesday morning, I stopped by my attorney's office in downtown Bellevue. His name was Daniel Brooks. We'd known each other for nearly 20 years. Daniel had handled Margaret's estate after she passed, updated my will, and helped me establish a living trust years earlier. He looked surprised when I walked into his office. Everything okay, Richard? I just want to review my paperwork. He smiled, planning another fishing trip. I wish. For nearly 2 hours, we reviewed every document connected to my estate. The deed, the trust, my retirement accounts, insurance policies, every signature, every beneficiary. Everything was exactly as Margaret and I had planned years ago. The house remained solely titled in my name and protected inside my revocable living trust. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Did something happen? I hesitated. Nothing I can prove. He folded his hands. Sometimes instinct are evidence waiting for facts. Those words stayed with me. When I returned home that afternoon, I didn't tell Ethan about the meeting. Instead, I started paying close attention. And once I started looking, I couldn't stop seeing things I'd ignored before. Jessica had begun referring to my home as our future place. Not jokingly, seriously. Whenever friends visited during family barbecues, she'd casually say things like, "When we finally move in here." At first people laughed. Eventually, no one did. Then came the renovation conversations. Without asking me, Ethan showed up one Saturday carrying brochures from a remodeling company. He spread them across my dining room table like we were business partners. We could knock down this wall. The kitchen needs modern cabinets. The upstairs bathroom should become a master suite. I stared at him. We. He blinked. Well, eventually, that word again. I folded every brochure, stacked them neatly, and handed them back. I'm not remodeling Margaret's house. His smile disappeared. You've got to stop living in the past. I looked around my dining room. The same chandelier Margaret picked. The same oak table where we celebrated birthdays for 4 decades. The same window where she'd stand every morning watering her flowers. No, I answered quietly. I'm honoring it. He grabbed the brochures without another word. For the first time in his life, my son looked disappointed that I hadn't agreed with him. 2 weeks later, another strange thing happened. I came home from grocery shopping and found Jessica inside my bedroom, alone. She jumped slightly when she saw me. "Oh, Richard." I was just... She glanced toward my dresser, looking for old family photo albums. It didn't make sense. The albums were kept downstairs in the living room cabinet, not inside my bedroom, not beside my desk. I didn't accuse her of anything. I simply nodded. They are downstairs. She smiled awkwardly and hurried past me. As I watched her leave the room, my eyes drifted toward the small fireproof safe inside my bedroom closet. It was still locked, but for reasons I couldn't explain. I walked over and checked it anyway. Everything inside remained untouched. The deed, trust documents, Margaret's handwritten letters, birth certificates, investment records. Nothing appeared missing. Still, someone had been looking. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone on my back porch with a cup of coffee. Rain tapped softly against the roof while memories of Margaret filled the silence. She always had a remarkable instinct about people. Years ago she'd once told me, "Richard, greed doesn't appear overnight. It grows quietly until someone believes they're entitled to what isn't theirs." Back then, I hadn't fully understood what she meant. Now, I was beginning to. And deep inside, a feeling I couldn't shake kept growing stronger. My son and his wife weren't waiting for me to decide what happened to my home anymore. They were already acting like a decision had been made. What I still didn't know was just how far they were willing to go to make sure I disappeared from the picture. The older I get, the more I believe that people reveal who they truly are when they think you're no longer paying attention. So I stopped talking, and I started listening. Over the next several weeks, I acted exactly the way Ethan and Jessica expected me to. I smiled through family dinners. I thanked them for every little favor. I pretended not to notice the whispered conversations that suddenly stopped whenever I entered the room. The truth was, I wasn't ignoring anything anymore. I was collecting pieces of a puzzle I didn't yet understand. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan invited me over to his townhouse in Redmond for my grandson Noah's birthday party. The house was packed with relatives, neighbors, and children running through the backyard with balloons tied to their wrists. Everything looked perfectly normal, until I accidentally overheard a conversation that wasn't meant for me. I had stepped inside to refill my glass of iced tea when I heard Jessica speaking quietly in the kitchen. "It's only a matter of time," she whispered. Another woman's voice answered, "So the house will finally be yours." Jessica laughed. "It already feels like ours." My footsteps froze. She continued, "We've already planned where the kids' bedrooms will be. Ethan wants to turn Richard's workshop into a home office." The woman chuckled. "And Richard—" Jessica shrugged. "He won't need that much space where he's going." I stood there in complete silence, not angry, not shocked, just disappointed. For them, I wasn't a father. I wasn't a grandfather. I had become a timetable. A waiting period, a problem that hadn't solved itself fast enough. I quietly walked back outside before either of them noticed me. For the rest of the party, I smiled for family photos, helped Noah unwrap his birthday gifts, and never mentioned what I'd heard, because confronting people too early only teaches them to hide better. A week later, Ethan called. "Dad, can you stop by tomorrow evening? Jessica made your favorite pot roast." His voice sounded unusually cheerful, almost rehearsed. When I arrived, dinner felt strangely formal. Candles, fresh flowers, even a bottle of wine. Jessica hardly ever cooked like that unless guests were visiting. Halfway through the meal, Ethan cleared his throat. "So, here it comes," I thought. "We've been talking." I nodded. I figured. Jessica leaned forward. "We found a wonderful senior community near Gig Harbor." She slid a glossy brochure across the table. Private apartments, medical staff, walking trails, group activities. Everything looked beautiful. If someone actually wanted to live there, Ethan and I even toured it for you. I smiled politely. That was thoughtful. "It gets better," Ethan added. "If you move there, we'll move into your house." He said it so casually, as if he'd just suggested borrowing my lawnmower. I set my fork down. "And why would you move into my house?" They exchanged a quick glance. Jessica answered first. "It just makes sense. Bigger yard, better schools, more room for the kids." Ethan nodded eagerly. "And you'd still see us all the time." Something about that sentence felt hollow, because every benefit he listed belonged to him, not me. I took a slow sip of water. I'm perfectly happy where I am. Silence settled over the table. Jessica forced another smile. You shouldn't make decisions based on emotion. I looked directly at her. Funny. I was about to say the same thing. Nobody spoke for nearly 30 seconds. Then Ethan changed the subject. But I could tell. They hadn't expected resistance. Driving home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about Margaret. She always believed a home reflected the people living inside it. For decades, ours had been filled with laughter, respect, and quiet love. Now, every conversation about that house revolved around ownership. Never memories, never family. Ownership. 2 mornings later, something happened that erased every remaining doubt in my mind. I was watering Margaret's roses when my next-door neighbor, Helen, walked across the driveway. Helen had lived beside us for almost 30 years. She knew my family almost as well as I did. She looked hesitant. Richard, can I ask you something? Of course. She lowered her voice. I hope you don't mind. But why are you selling your house? I blinked. I'm not. She frowned. That's strange. I felt my stomach tighten. Why? I ran into Ethan and Jessica at the garden center yesterday. She paused. They said you'd already decided to move into assisted living. For several long seconds, I couldn't speak. Helen continued. They asked if I'd recommend painters because they wanted to renovate before moving in. The watering hose slipped slightly in my hand. They weren't just imagining a future anymore. They were telling other people it was already happening. Without asking me, without my permission, without my knowledge. That evening, I sat alone in Margaret's old reading chair, staring at the framed family portrait above the fireplace. It had been taken 20 years earlier. Ethan stood between us with one arm around each parent. Back then, I would have trusted him with my life. Now, I wasn't even sure I could trust him with a spare house key. As I looked around the living room, something caught my attention. The small wooden bowl near the front door. That's where I'd always kept my extra keys. Only one key was missing. I searched every drawer, every countertop, every jacket pocket. Nothing. Maybe I'd misplaced it. Or maybe someone had decided they no longer needed to ask permission before entering a house they already believed belonged to them. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about inheritance anymore. Someone was beginning to act as though I no longer had the right to control my own home. I had a feeling the next move they made wouldn't be a conversation. It would be a decision. One they believed I was too old to stop. The missing key bothered me far more than I wanted to admit. Maybe I'd misplaced it. Maybe it had fallen behind a drawer. Maybe I was simply becoming forgetful. That's exactly what I wanted to believe. But something deep inside me kept whispering the same uncomfortable question. What if I wasn't imagining any of this? I decided not to accuse anyone. Instead, I made one small change. The following Monday morning, I drove to a local locksmith in Bellevue and had every exterior lock on my house replaced. Front door, back door, garage entrance, even the side gate. The young locksmith asked if I'd recently lost my keys. I smiled politely. Let's just say I'm updating my security. He handed me a brand new set of keys that afternoon. Only one copy stayed in my pocket. The spare went into my fireproof safe. Nobody else received one. Not even Ethan. 3 days passed quietly. Then, on Thursday evening, my phone rang. It was Ethan. His voice sounded unusually irritated. Dad, did you change the locks? I looked out my living room window. Parked in my driveway was Ethan's pickup truck. Jessica sat in the passenger seat with her arms folded. I did. A long silence followed. Why? I felt like it. Dad. His tone hardened. We've always had a key. You did. So why change it without telling us? I leaned back in my chair. Because it's my house. He didn't answer immediately. Then he laughed. Not because something was funny. Because he couldn't believe I'd said it. We were trying to surprise you. With what? Jessica's voice suddenly came through the speaker. We brought contractors. I walked to the front window again. Sure enough, another truck had pulled into the driveway. Two men wearing construction company uniforms were standing outside, studying my front porch while holding clipboards. For several seconds, I honestly thought I was misunderstanding what I was seeing. I opened the front door. Ethan smiled awkwardly. "There you are." Behind him, one of the contractors waved. "We're just here to take measurements." "For what?" Jessica answered before Ethan could. "We figured we'd start planning the renovations now." I stared at her. Planning for what? The house. She said it as though the answer were obvious. "We don't want to waste time later." I looked past them toward the contractors. "I'm sorry, gentlemen. There won't be any measurements today." They exchanged confused looks. Ethan stepped closer. "Dad, don't make this awkward." I lowered my voice. "No, you're the one making it awkward." The older contractor cleared his throat. "So, if this isn't a good time, we can come back." "There won't be another time." His expression changed immediately. He looked at Ethan. "You told us the property owner approved the consultation." For the first time all afternoon, nobody spoke. The contractor slowly closed his clipboard. "I think we've been given the wrong information." Within seconds, both men climbed back into their truck and drove away. Jessica's face turned bright red. As soon as they disappeared around the corner, Ethan exploded. "What was that?" "I could ask you the same thing." "We're trying to help you." "No," I answered calmly. "You're trying to make decisions that don't belong to you." Jessica folded her arms. "We're only thinking about the future." "I am too." "Then act like it." I looked directly at my son. "I already am." His jaw tightened. "You know everyone thinks you're being stubborn." I smiled faintly. That's usually what people call someone who refuses to give them what they want. For a moment, nobody moved. Even the neighborhood seemed unusually quiet. Finally, Ethan shook his head. "You've changed." Those words hurt, because they weren't true. I hadn't changed. I'd simply stopped saying yes. Without another word, they got back into the truck and drove away. I stood in my driveway long after they disappeared. Not because I was angry, because I finally accepted something I'd been avoiding for months. This wasn't about concern anymore. It wasn't about family. It wasn't even about my health. It was about control. That night, I called Daniel Brooks. "I think it's getting worse." His voice immediately became serious. "What happened?" I explained everything. The missing key, the contractors, the conversations, the false claims to my neighbors. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sighed. "Richard, I think it's time we strengthen your legal protections." The next morning, I met him at his office. He already had several documents waiting on his desk. We reviewed every detail of my estate plan. Then he asked one unexpected question. If someone tried to pressure you into leaving your home, who would believe your version of events? I frowned. "I don't know." "Then let's make sure they don't have to rely on memory." He suggested something surprisingly simple. From that day forward, I documented everything. Every unexpected visit, every phone call, every text message, every conversation about the house. Dates, times, locations, who was present, exactly what was said. Not because I wanted revenge. Because facts don't forget. People do. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan's messages became more frequent. "Have you thought about the retirement community? Jessica found another great place for you. The kids really need a backyard. You're making this harder than it has to be." Each message sounded polite on the surface, but underneath, there was pressure, constant, persistent, growing stronger every day. Then one Friday evening, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Ethan. It was my neighbor Helen. Her voice trembled. "Richard, I think you should come home." My heart immediately sank. "Why?" She hesitated before answering. "Because your son is standing in your driveway and is showing your house to strangers." In that moment, every remaining doubt disappeared. They weren't waiting for my permission anymore. They had already started acting like I no longer owned the place. What I didn't realize was that the confrontation waiting for me that evening would change my relationship with my son forever and lead to the 6 words no father should ever hear from his own child that I don't remember how fast I drove home that evening. I only remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Helen's words kept echoing inside my head. Your son is showing your house to strangers. Every traffic light felt too long. Every slow driver felt unbearable. By the time I turned onto Northeast 24th Street, my stomach was already telling me what I was about to see. 3 unfamiliar SUVs were parked along the curb. A real estate agent stood in my front yard holding a folder. 2 young couples wandered through my backyard, pointing at the deck Margaret and I had built together nearly 20 years earlier. And standing on my front porch was my son, laughing, like he already owned the place. For a moment, I simply sat inside my truck. I wasn't angry. I was heartbroken, not because strangers were looking at my house, because my own son had crossed a line I never imagined he would. I stepped out and slowly walked toward the front yard. The real estate agent noticed me first. "Good afternoon, so. Can I help you?" Before I could answer, Ethan quickly walked over. "Dad!" "I was going to call you." "Were you?" His smile disappeared. Jessica joined him, trying to sound cheerful. "We're just exploring possibilities." I looked past them at the visitors. "Who are these people?" The real estate agent answered politely. "I'm Michael Foster with Evergreen Premier Realty." He extended his hand. "We've had several families interested in this property." I stared at him without shaking his hand. "This property isn't for sale." His smile faded instantly. "I'm sorry. It has never been listed." He turned toward Ethan. "Mr. Lawson told us the family had agreed to sell after his father relocated." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael looked from Ethan to me, then back again. "You mean?" I interrupted him. "I am Richard Lawson, and I have absolutely no intention of selling my home." The poor man's face drained a color. He immediately closed his folder. "I'm terribly sorry, so." I was given completely different information. "I understand." He apologized again before quickly gathering the visitors together. Within minutes, every car disappeared from the street. Only Ethan and Jessica remained. Neither of them looked at me. Finally, I broke the silence. "Would one of you like to explain what just happened?" Jessica spoke first. "We were only planning ahead." "No," I answered calmly. "You were pretending to own something that isn't yours." Ethan let out a long breath. "You always overreact." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Overreact. You invited strangers onto my property. You contacted a realtor. You discussed selling my house. And somehow I'm overreacting. His expression hardened. "You don't understand." "Then help me. We need this house." There it was. Not want, need. As housing prices keep climbing, we'll never afford a place like this. I nodded slowly. "I understand that. But this house isn't your solution." Jessica crossed her arms. "It should be." Those 3 words hit me harder than anything she'd ever said. Should be. Not because they'd earned it. Not because I'd offered it. Simply because they believed they deserved it. I looked directly at my son. "When did you become so entitled?" His jaw tightened. "We're thinking about our children's future." "And who spent 40 years thinking about yours?" He looked away. For the first time since arriving, he couldn't meet my eyes. I thought the conversation might finally be over. I was wrong. Jessica stepped closer until we were only a few feet apart. "You know what everyone says." I stayed silent. "They all think it's selfish." "What is?" "One old man living alone in a 4-bedroom house while his grandchildren are cramped in a townhouse." I smiled sadly. "So now my home belongs to public opinion." She didn't answer. Instead, Ethan finally exploded. "We've been patient. We waited long enough. Mom would have wanted us here." The mention of Margaret stopped me cold. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Then I answered quietly, "Don't speak for your mother. You don't know what she'd want. I knew her for 41 years. You've only known adulthood for 20. His face turned red. You always think you're right. No, I just know whose name is on the deed. Something changed inside him the moment I said those words. The frustration disappeared. So did the guilt. What replaced it was something I'd never seen directed toward me before. Resentment. Pure resentment. He took one slow step forward. You know what your problem is. I waited. You stopped being family the day you chose a house over your own son. I felt my chest tighten. Then, before I could answer, he delivered the words that no parent is ever prepared to hear. You're not family anymore. Time seemed to stop. The neighborhood disappeared. The wind disappeared. Even the sounds of passing traffic faded into silence. I looked at the little boy I once taught to ride a bicycle. The teenager whose baseball games I never missed. The young man whose college tuition I worked endless overtime to pay. And standing in front of me, I couldn't recognize him anymore. I expected myself to cry, to argue, to defend everything I'd sacrificed. Instead, a calmness settled over me that I still can't fully explain. I smiled, not because those words didn't hurt. They did, more than anything ever had. But because, at that exact moment, I realized something neither Ethan nor Jessica had taken the time to confirm. They had spent months planning renovations, months planning a move, months trying to sell a property, months treating me like a guest in my own home. Yet they had never once verified the one fact that mattered most. The house they believed they controlled still belonged entirely to me, and what happened over the next few minutes would destroy every assumption they'd been building for nearly a year. For several long seconds, nobody said a word. Ethan stood there with his arms crossed, convinced he'd finally forced me into a corner. Jessica wore the faintest smile, almost as if she believed the hardest part was over. They expected tears. They expected guilt. Maybe even an apology. Instead, I looked at both of them and quietly said, "Are you finished?" Ethan frowned. "What?" I asked if you're finished. Because now it's my tone. The confidence on Jessica's face faded just a little. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone, not to call the police, not to record them. I simply opened my contacts and pressed one name, Daniel Brooks. He answered almost immediately. "Richard, I think it's time. I'll be there in 15 minutes. I ended the call without another word. Ethan looked confused. Who was that? My attorney. Jessica let out a short laugh. A lawyer. For what? I smiled. You'll see. Neither of them spoke again. About 20 minutes later, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. Daniel stepped out carrying a slim leather briefcase. He had spent more than 20 years handling my legal affairs, and one look at my face told him everything he needed to know. He walked over, shook my hand, then looked at Ethan and Jessica. "Good evening." Neither of them returned the greeting. Daniel remained perfectly calm. "Richard told me there's been some confusion regarding ownership of this property." Ethan answered before I could. "There isn't any confusion. I'm his only son. When Dad moves out, this house becomes ours." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "According to whom?" "My father." I quietly shook my head. "I've never said that." Jessica stepped forward. "But eventually we'll inherit it." Daniel gave a polite smile. "Perhaps. But expectation and ownership are two very different things." I could see Ethan becoming impatient. "What difference does it make?" Daniel slowly opened his briefcase and removed a neatly organized folder. "I think this will explain." He handed Ethan a copy of the property's recorded deed. "I don't need paperwork. I already know it's my dad's house." Daniel nodded. "Exactly. Your father's." He pointed to a specific line. "The sole legal owner of this property is Richard Allen Lawson. No co-owner. No transfer. No life estate. No pending sale. No shared title." Jessica folded her arms. "So," Daniel calmly continued, "furthermore, this property is held inside Mr. Lawson's living trust. It cannot be transferred simply because someone expects to inherit it." Ethan laughed nervously. "Eventually it'll still come to me." Daniel looked directly into his eyes. "That depends entirely on your father's wishes." The smile disappeared from Ethan's face. "What do you mean?" Daniel turned toward me. Richard, I think it's your decision whether you'd like to tell them. I took a slow breath. For months, I'd hoped none of this would become necessary. I'd hoped my son would remember who he was. Instead, he'd shown strangers my home, tried to renovate it, attempted to sell it, and finally, he'd told me I wasn't family anymore. I looked directly at him. About 6 weeks ago, I updated my trust. His eyes widened. What? I made changes. Jessica's voice became sharp. What kind of changes? I answered honestly. The kind that responsible homeowners make when circumstances change. Daniel removed another document. It was legally executed, notarized, and properly filed. Ethan stared at me. You changed your will. I changed more than that. I changed my entire estate plan. The color slowly drained from Jessica's face. No, you wouldn't. I already did. Silence filled the driveway. I continued. You both spent the last year assuming this house was already yours. You never once asked what I wanted. You never asked how I felt. You only discussed when I'd leave. My voice never rose. It didn't need to. The moment you stopped seeing me as your father and started seeing me as an obstacle, everything changed. Ethan shook his head. So where does the house go now? I looked around the front yard. The maple tree Margaret planted, the porch swing we'd built together, the flower bed she'd cared for every spring. Then I answered, it goes to people who still understand what family means. Daniel quietly added, Mr. Lawson has established a charitable housing trust. Upon his passing, the property will be sold. The proceeds will fund transitional housing for military veterans and widowed seniors throughout King County. Neither Ethan nor Jessica moved. They simply stared at me, as if they hadn't heard correctly. Jessica finally whispered, You're giving away everything. I nodded. Not everything. I'm giving it to people who appreciate a home, instead of treating it like a prize. Ethan's voice cracked. You'd choose strangers over your own son. I looked at him with tears forming in my eyes. No, I chose my values over your greed. For nearly 70 years, I believe that family is built on love, gratitude, and respect. You stopped offering all three. Another long silence settled over the driveway. For the first time since Margaret died, my son looked genuinely afraid, not because he had lost a house, because he had finally realized he was about to lose something far more valuable. And for the first time since this nightmare began, he understood that the decisions he'd made couldn't simply be undone with an apology. I wish I could tell you that Ethan immediately apologized, that he broke down, hugged me, and realized how badly he'd lost his way. Life doesn't always give you endings like that. For several moments, nobody spoke. The evening air felt strangely still, and the only sound came from the wind rustling through the maple tree Margaret had planted the year Ethan started kindergarten. My son looked at me as though he was seeing a complete stranger. I can't believe you do this, he finally whispered. I nodded slowly. I can. His eyebrows knitted together. What does that mean? It means I spent the last year watching my own son plan a future that depended on removing me from my own home. You never once asked what I wanted. You only talk about what you wanted. His eyes dropped toward the driveway. For the first time that evening, he had no argument. Jessica, however, wasn't ready to let go. This is emotional. You'll regret it. Daniel calmly closed his briefcase. No, Mrs. Lawson. What Mr. Lawson has done is the opposite of emotional. It's documented. It's legal. And after everything that's occurred, it's entirely reasonable. Jessica looked at Ethan, silently hoping he'd say something to change my mind. Instead, he stood frozen. I walked over to the porch and rested my hand on the old wooden railing Margaret and I had painted together years ago. You know what's sad? Neither of them answered. This house was never the most valuable thing I owned. I turned to face them. You were. I would have gladly helped you buy a home. I would have contributed to your down payment. I would have created a college fund twice as large for Noah and Lily. I would have done all of it. But generosity only works when it's met with gratitude, not entitlement. Tears formed in Ethan's eyes. I made mistakes. Yes, you did. But mistakes can be forgiven. Character is harder to rebuild. For the first time in months, I saw my little boy again, not the angry 42-year-old standing in front of me, but the frightened child who used to run into my arms after falling off his bicycle. I was under pressure. Dad, housing prices, the kids. I know. I understand every one of those problems. But none of them gave you permission to stop treating me like your father. His shoulders slumped. Jessica quietly reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Deep down, I think he finally understood something. None of this had started with the house. It had started the day he allowed greed to speak louder than love. Daniel checked his watch before quietly excusing himself. If you need anything else, Richard, give me a call. I will. After he drove away, Ethan remained standing in the driveway. Dad! His voice barely rose above a whisper. Is there anything I can do? I looked at him for a long time before answering. You can start by visiting me because you want to see me, not because you want to see this house. He nodded slowly. I understand. I hope someday you really do. He turned toward his truck without saying another word. Jessica followed him, but before climbing into the passenger seat, she looked back one last time. There was no anger left in her expression, only regret, whether it was regret for losing the house or regret for losing our family. I'll probably never know. Their truck disappeared around the corner, leaving me alone once again. Oddly enough, the house had never felt quieter, but it had also never felt more peaceful. A few months later, I received a handwritten letter. It wasn't from Ethan. It was from my grandson, Noah. His mother had helped him write it. The spelling wasn't perfect. The sentences wandered. But one line stopped me cold. Grandpa, I don't care who gets the house. I just miss eating pancakes with you on Saturdays. I cried harder reading that letter than I had at Margaret's funeral, because children see what adults often forget. Love has never lived inside walls. It lives inside moments. The following weekend, I invited Noah and Lily over, just the two of them. We made blueberry pancakes exactly the way Margaret used to. We planted fresh roses beside the front porch. We spent the afternoon building a birdhouse in my workshop. Not once did we talk about money. Not once did we mention inheritance. They simply wanted their grandfather. And for the first time in a very long while, that was enough. Months later, Ethan called. Not to ask about the house. Not to discuss paperwork. He asked if we could have coffee together. Just the two of us. Healing didn't happen overnight. Trust rarely does. We talked. We listened. Some conversations were uncomfortable. Some ended in silence. But slowly, we began rebuilding something far more valuable than property. Respect. I never changed my estate plan. The charitable trust remains exactly as it was written. Not because I wanted to punish my son, but because I wanted my final decision to reflect the values Margaret and I spent 41 years living by. A home should never become a reward for greed. It should always remain a symbol of love, sacrifice, and integrity. Today, I still wake up every morning in the same brick house on Northeast 24th Street. I still drink my coffee on the front porch. I still talk to Margaret whenever I water her roses. The difference is that I no longer confuse peace with pleasing everyone. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't giving people everything they ask for. Sometimes it's teaching them that respect cannot be inherited. It must be owned. My son once looked me in the eyes and said, "You're not family anymore." Those words nearly broke my heart, but they also reminded me of something I'll never forget. A name on a deed can protect a house. A name on a birth certificate can make someone your child, but only love, loyalty, and respect can make someone family. And that's the only inheritance that has ever truly mattered.